Ted really set us up beautifully, because if you were listening carefully to the last 2 or 3 minutes of that discussion, he talked about the robust bull market that we've seen in biotechnology, and he asked the panelists a question about reimbursement, and that's exactly the two primary targets that I want to focus on in this panel. So I'd like to invite our panelists to come on up, Brian Abrams, John Doyle, Michael Werner, and Emile Westergaard. And I'll give you a little bit of background on each of the panelists and you know, what we're hoping to accomplish. Maybe we can go to my first slide. So each one of these panelists has different expertise in different areas. Brian Abrams has navigated CMS and the reimbursement structures and really has done a fantastic job at taking a product that was initially rejected by government reimbursement and has navigated that. So we should be very interested to understand that process. John Doyle is going to talk a little bit about value and outcomes and excellence from the point of view of advising clients from a CRO. And I believe that's going to be mission critical going forward. Michael Werner, who many of you know as an attorney, is also a tremendous advocate for the cell therapy space, and I want to talk a little bit about what the perceptions are in Washington around cell therapy. We're not just talking about embryonic cells, and how do we break that mindset? And Emile Westergaard, who I spoke with a little bit earlier this week, has a very interesting background. He can talk a little bit about reimbursement and about capitation, but he also has experience on the buy side from looking at how you invest in these companies. So one of the things that I think has really happened is the number one question that I'm asked as an analyst is, are we in a bubble? Are we just waiting for valuations to collapse? Now, I have to tell you, I've been asked that question for the last 10 years. And in Y2K, we saw biotech valuations just exploding up. And so when I'm asked that question today, I say, no, I don't think we're in a bubble. I think the best is yet to come. I'm very excited by what we're seeing, the convergence of science coming together and innovative new therapies. And we can talk about kind of the CAR-T space today as being the favorite child. But I'll tell you, when you look at some of the companies that are presenting today and the valuation gap that exists between those companies and where CAR-T is, you know, it's amazing to me. And I think the best is yet to come. However, I will say this. What is the headwind going to be for us as investors and as we look at these companies? And I believe it's going to be a reimbursement. So if we can go to the next slide, we can see that reimbursement is in the papers every day. We constantly are hearing about it. Let's go back to the next slide. And we see that this is actually something that's not new. In 1988, we were hearing about it, and it was headlines in the paper. Let's keep going. Next slide. And in 1971, it was headlines in the paper, the outrageous nature of the cost of new medicines. And if we go to the next slide, and we see that in 1966, its story was still about the incredible high prices of drugs. And we go to the next slide, and we see back in 1959, that drug pricing was a major struggle in Washington. And we go back to the next slide, 1947, and let's go back to the next slide, 1917, and go back to the next slide. So you can see that there's a theme here. You know, this is not a new theme. So when we talk about Gilead and we talked about Sovaldi or Harvoni, you know, we have to think about what is the value versus the cost. Let's go to the next slide. And what we're seeing here is that one of the biggest factors today in healthcare isn't so much the cost, but what is the discounting structure that's going on. And I think you're going to be hearing more and more about this, about how different products that are similar and have very similar attributes, how do they get prescribed? How do they get authorized? What discounts get negotiated? And I think this is clearly one of the hottest topics in the space. Next slide. And I'd leave you with really a couple of focus points, and this is outcomes. If you look at congestive heart failure, what you find is that this is very much an unmet medical need today. The cost of rehospitalizations, the mortality costs show you that we are just not there yet. And so that begs the question that if companies like Neostem and Athersys and Mesoblast are successful, if Mesoblast is successful with Revascor and they can lower rehospitalization rates and reduce mortality and take $400,000 or $500,000 or $1 million of downstream cost out of the system, then what is the value of that? And I believe that that is the promise of cell therapy. And my last slide is a survey that ARM did last year. And what we see is that while manufacturing was our focus a year ago and pharma's really worried, can you make it? Going forward, reimbursement continues to be a very, very hot topic. How much is enough? How much can you charge? And there are many, many areas we could look at. We can look at congestive heart failure, or we can look at niche orphan drugs, and the amount of the high prices of orphan drugs in and of themselves haven't been a factor. But in aggregate, the number of high-priced therapies that are now in the pipeline that are coming to the market are certainly going to be placing a burden on the system. So with that, let's start the panel and talk a little bit about reimbursement issues. Thank you. So maybe we could start out a little bit with Michael and talk about kind of the political environment in Washington. What's it going to take in Washington to get, Congress, to get the Senate to understand that cell therapy doesn't mean embryonic cell therapy? It seems like that our political leaders are back in like 20 years behind where the marketplace is sometimes. And I think this becomes very important because we know that politically acceptance of cell therapy and reimbursement and CMS ultimately get tied together.
Yeah. So thank you, and that's a great question, and certainly. So I've been an advocate in D.C. on Capitol Hill, as well as at FDA, CMS, and elsewhere for the better part of 2 decades now on regenerative medicine issues, and so I've been able to see some progression. So for sure. Embryonic stem cells was a hot topic some years ago. It was a hot topic because it was the kind of subject that, first of all, was controversial, and so the press likes that, and if the press likes that, Congress likes it, right? So that's the first thing. And the second thing was because, of course, it brought up sort of age-old political debates around abortion and things like that have been going on for a really long time. We've seen, I think, a little bit of a change over the last several years where, so for example, when I go to talk to members of Congress about regenerative medicine or cell therapy, it's a lot less frequent that I get a question about embryonic stem cells. I still will get it once in a while, particularly if someone is a pretty right-of-center member of Congress, and they'll say, well, tell me about regenerative medicine. I talk about the regenerative medicine industry, and they say, well, how much of that industry is embryonic stem cells? How many companies are involved in that? Which is kind of their way, I think, of sort of trying to gauge, is this a group that I want to be with or I'm concerned about? And so I'm not going to tell you that question doesn't come up, because it does, but it comes up a lot less than it used to come up. And that's partially because the issue has died down politically to some degree. It's also because I think there's a growing education. That's one of the things that the Alliance does, of course, is try to educate members of Congress and others about the field. And that includes that there is this clinical progress in the field that was talked about in the previous panel that you mentioned, Jason. And all of that kind of helps people understand that this is a broad field, that there's a lot of promise, and that if they really, really, really want to focus on embryonic stem cells, you can't really stop them from doing it. But more and more, I think people are understanding that this is a broad field and these new technologies have lots and lots of promise. So I think we're really trending in the right direction in this way, and I think over time, the controversy or the people who are really nervous about this will shrink in number.
Terrific. Thank you so much. John Doyle, can we talk a little bit about what a CRO does and what you do there, and how important is it when you're in phase 2 and heading into phase 3 to consider what the competitive landscape is in a reimbursement strategy so that you can essentially price your therapeutic in a way that the market will accept it?
Sure.
And I say that because, for the first time now, we're seeing multiple phase 2 and phase 3 trials in the cell therapy space that are active.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jason. I think the comments were made this morning, too, in the first session, that you really have to start early when you're thinking about your valuation, if you will, from a payment and reimbursement standpoint. So I like to think of it in terms of integrative asset development planning. So it's no longer a linear fashion of solving for the FDA, then solving for the EMA, or doing that in parallel, or vice versa. But it's also solving for health technology assessment agencies, as well as for Medicare and for U.S. managed care organizations in terms of what do they want to see. And many times it's incremental to what the regulator wants to see. They want to see subpopulations of interest. We saw that with Carticel, for instance. They want to see reimbursement pathways, how it all connects for the provider. We saw that with Prevenge, for instance. And now with Glybera, with the news that we saw in November and the submission to the German government, they're going to be looking at cost effectiveness. And so the trick is you really have to be thinking about all those things early in phase 2 and develop an evidence platform that's not only going to demonstrate a benefit-risk ratio that's favorable for the regulator, but a cost-benefit ratio that's favorable for the payer.
Okay. Well, help me understand when we get specific and we think about congestive heart failure, or we think about STEMIs, or we think in the cardiovascular space. Does that mean that it actually influences powering assumptions and endpoints and other parameters that companies have to consider?
Yeah, I think
other
so.
than just kind of getting approved through regulators? And is the U.S. different than Europe? And what about Asia?
So first question, I think, is, it makes changes to your clinical development plan, because you want to think through your endpoint strategy. You want to think through your subpopulation analysis strategy. You want to think very carefully about your comparators. We did an analysis of about 30 health technology assessments in Europe for gene and cell-based therapies that were submitted. And the likelihood was 2 to 1 in terms of rejection to acceptance. And most of the time, it was trial design factors that the HTA agencies like NICE in the UK and IQWiG in Germany that we're pointing to. So clinical trial design factors need to be thought through from a payer standpoint. And what's happening in the US, I think it's converging with what you see is happening in Europe. I've run a few of these international payer panels, and I've noticed over the years that it used to be just the European payers putting pressure on the pharma companies and the biotech companies with regard to demonstration of real-world value. And now the U.S., especially the larger, more sophisticated companies that have health technology assessment agencies inside their firms, they're pushing just as hard. And so they're requiring the same demonstration of value, and they want to see generalizable results to their membership population. So I think what that does, it requires almost like a parallel track. So you have your CDP and your clinical pathway focused on the regulator. You want to bake in some endpoints and some sub-analysis factored for the payer. At the same time, you want to be thinking about a disease registry. And that disease registry should start early. It can become a product registry once you launch, but you need that real-world evidence platform to continue to demonstrate real-world effectiveness, not just efficacy. And Asia is a bit unknown, but we do know that NICE is the big agency, right, in the UK. They're doing a lot of counseling to the Asian HTA agencies with regard to how they should go about measuring the value of products.
Is cell therapy different than small molecules when we think about value? Because when I look at cell therapy, I often think that it's one intervention versus, say, a chronic drug that I'm going to be taking for a long period of time. So I'm thinking that I want to get a very high price up front because I'm not going to be getting that repeat business.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I mean, I think a lot of that dovetails with the rare disease, orphan drug strategies, and you're starting to see some alternative payment plans for how to pay for these products. Because, yes, it might be a lump sum treatment, but the benefit might be conferred over a period of time. So maybe the payment can be conferred over a period of time as well. So I think there's going to be some different strategies there. And, they're in the crosshairs for most of these payers because they're going to scrutinize the value given the high price. But the price per cure is the big question. But the onus is on the manufacturer to demonstrate what the value of a cure is.
Thank you. And that's a perfect setup for you, Brian. So you can tell us a little bit about what was your experience at NewOO. Help us understand what is the product. It was launching into a relatively mature market, initially rejected for reimbursement. So help us understand what you've had to do to kind of acquire reimbursement and what the relaunch of that product has looked like in the marketplace. But give us the background.
Sure, thanks. So for those of you who know NewOO Therapeutics, we used to be Cytomedics, and we have a product out there that's an autologous product that uses a patient's own blood to promote wound healing. And as Jason was saying, wound healing, particularly in the diabetic space, is fairly mature, so there was a lot of challenge. When we first approached CMS in 2010, they had what's called a national non-coverage decision, which means that there's no way that it could get covered even at the local level because of this national mandate that there not be coverage in this space. Not in wound care, not in wound healing itself, but in the autologous blood space. So we actually went back and did a couple of smaller studies, got those published, and then went back to CMS and said, okay, now we'd like to request that this national non-coverage be removed for our product. CMS deliberated over it for a little while. This was in 2011. And they said, well, the product is promising, but we still aren't convinced on the evidence. And the reason that they weren't convinced was because they felt that that the evidence that we presented was not generalizable to the Medicare population because of the sample size and some of the demographic of the subjects. So they said instead of removing coverage entirely, removing the non-coverage entirely, what we'll do is give you coverage with evidence development, which means that in exchange for coverage on a national level, CMS expected data collection, analysis, and publication. So in 2014, they approved our protocols to do just that. And then we moved forward with that and have basically been relaunching the product since that time, really since the first quarter of this year, when we are actually out in community-based wound care centers, not so much academic, a couple of academic institutions which are used to research, but really what we're trying to do is get real-world results that are generalizable to Medicare patients, not sort of the RCT situation where it might not have the real world results that Medicare is looking for.
Sorry, what is RCT?
Oh, I'm sorry, randomized controlled trial.
Thank you.
Sorry, not really in that environment, but really in the real world environment. And so we have relaunched the product, and we actually have our commercial team out in the community health centers, wound care centers. And they are followed by our clinical team to discuss the protocol and discuss what's necessary at a lot of these research-naive centers, what's necessary in terms of record keeping and in terms of reporting back so that the data that we'll have at the end of the protocols as we're collecting them will be consistent. And so in the meantime, while all this is happening, each time they treat a patient, either randomized to the treatment arm with our product or not treated with our product, Medicare is paying for that treatment on a national basis. And so really, it's kind of like a commercial launch with a couple of other complications attached to it.
So hindsight's always 20/20, but if I think a little bit about what some of the things that John was talking about in hindsight, if you had run a different pivotal program, could you have avoided this? Could you have avoided having to go back and forth with CMS and negotiate reimbursement?
So I think that there has always been a level of skepticism at CMS, not just about cell therapy and kind of where to place it, but also in the wound care space itself, because they've paid for stuff and it's ended up not working, and they're just paying for treatment after treatment after treatment. Many of the products out there are excellent and they work beautifully and they should be paid for, but CMS was burned in the past. And so I think that with that level of skepticism in this space, yes, we probably could have avoided it, but I still think that they might have taken a little bit more of a stringent view than they would have on other therapies.
So, there might be some major lessons here for some of the companies that are now in phase 2 or in pivotal trials in terms of what they need to do. Do you negotiate and kind of contact with CMS early on in the process to say, when my product is approved, what's it going to take to be reimbursed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the best approach these days is to really go to them prior. And they actually have expressed, to me personally, and also to those who go in, I'm sure, Michael, you've heard it as well, that they appreciate you going in advance and discussing it so that they kind of know what's coming down the pike. And it's not so that they can, build up the walls against it, but so that they can understand what they're going to be facing, the type of technology that they're going to have to be dealing with, and that way they can discuss with the sponsor how, what types of things they're going to be looking to evaluate.
Great, and that's a great segue for us to talk a little bit with Emile. Emile, I know that you're kind of involved in two different things. We talked about some of your historical backgrounds. You've been on the buy side. You've run capital. You've looked at investing in the space. So obviously, I'm interested in your views as to what you think is investable here. But tell us a little bit about what you're working on now. And I know we talked earlier this week about capitation and about reimbursement and really advising clients how to navigate that structure so that they can understand how to position their product and what their expected pricing might be, which is obviously critical in terms of what they're going to be willing to spend in product development. So help me understand how you would advise clients today.
Well, I think as an investor and as an advisor, it's really a forward-looking view of what does the changing payer landscape mean for companies and products going forward. And from our perspective, information technology is at the center of that, both from the companies creating technology in the biotech space, understanding them as really not only a biotech company, but an information repository, and that they are sitting on incredibly valuable information that they can leverage with payers that now really, based on information technology, have for the first time the ability to process that information in a holistic sense, really all the way from the providers to the individual patient, and capture all of the clinically relevant data, but also all of the cost relevant data. And I think it's a real opportunity for companies with true breakthrough technology to go to payers with a much more holistic view of their benefit to the system, because in the end, whether it's Germany or whether it's a Humana in the capitated space in the US, and you have to recognize that there's been a paradigm shift in the US payers to taking capitated risk at the patient level across millions of patients. That is an information technology-driven shift in the marketplace. And that's an opportunity for companies with true technology to go out and say, this is not just a product, as I think we were mentioning, and talking about whether it's a near-term understanding or something that needs to be understood over a period of time, to capture all of the cost that you're preventing in conjunction, and really viewing yourself as a partner to the payer in a disease management aspect of being able to capture and help the payer to understand that information more effectively. So going back to what John was saying about understanding these dynamics from the moment you initiate clinical trials to be able to capture that holistic data. And you really need to, in my mind, affiliate yourself with technology in order to do that. And that technology is moving very quickly. That's wearables, that's apps that can interface with patients in real time. So you're really understanding the impact of your product and your approach and your ability to intervene with those patients in real time to provide a more holistic approach to that disease, and ultimately, in my mind, potentially actually price your drugs higher based on a holistic view of what your benefit is to the system.
So, if you're a mesoblast and you're in a 1,700-person clinical trial for congestive heart failure being run by Teva, what do you actually do as part of that trial in order to determine, and if I'm mesoblast, I'm thinking I want to get the highest price I can. I know that this is essentially, let's assume for now, a one-time intervention. I'm going to be delivering cells, into a patient one time. Can I charge $100,000 for that based on the fact that I'm going to claim that I'm reducing $500,000 worth of costs over 5 years? How does that play out in reality?
So I think there's been discussions of different payment models that can be used, and even with a one-time treatment, with significant data capture capabilities now to be able to see the impact of that treatment over a longer period of time. It may be that you have to get paid for that treatment over time based on your ability to actually prevent downstream utilization of the system. And so from an investor perspective, that actually can be more attractive in the sense of it's almost like a subscription model for a drug where you get people and you say, and you're going to be involved with the payer in following that patient over time, in observing those needs and that reimbursement, and partnering, as I said, with the systems to make sure that you're capturing the full value of your product. Whether you can do that on an upfront basis, as an investor and a cash flow-driven person, I think you go to payers with a one-time cost, it's very difficult. And I think we've seen it already in certain discrete products, particularly when they've gone out to capitated payers and said, $100,000 upfront for a one-time treatment versus a 12-month drug where you're taking a pill. And this is a very morbid way to put it, but if half the people are going to die, they're going to pay for the 12-month pill if the data is comparable. So you need to evolve your ways of thinking about.
It's really interesting, and I agree with you that if it's a one-time treatment at $100,000, it's easy to kind of be a target, right?
Right.
But how do you evolve to kind of a multi-modality where you're going to pay for a product over time when you're not actually going to get that? You're going to get that product at one time.
Well, I think this goes back to a company with a very specific disease treatment is actually a repository of tremendous information around that disease, not just their therapy. And they need to understand that. They need to capture that. They need to work with technology partners to then fully integrate that into a disease management approach. You can't just go out and say, I got a drug, here, use it. You've really got to think holistically about that patient, about the payer's risk model, how they're getting paid to manage that risk. They're taking risks.
John, you're shaking your head. You're seeing.
Yeah,
is this a part of the discussions
absolutely.
that you're?
Just to extend what Emile is saying, I think in Europe it's pretty prevalent, these pay-for-performance deals, risk-based contracting they call it, or managed entry strategies. But essentially the concept of the manufacturer going at risk based on what real-world effectiveness they demonstrate downstream. It's not very dissimilar from coverage with evidence development. But the idea is, can we engage with U.S. payers because they are at risk? They're pushing more risk out to their membership and to their provider network through ACOs and through health insurance exchanges. Can a manufacturer sit with them and say, we're going to develop a risk-based contract so that the payment terms is going to be commensurate based on the real-world data demonstration of our value to you as a system? And I expect to see a lot more of that.
When I just add to that, when you have software and Apple just came out with the watch with actual research technology capabilities to capture real-time end-user data, being able to integrate your technology with that data so that you're actually at the patient's side and you're collecting that data along with the payer and helping the payer to more effectively use that with your disease-specific expertise, because you're going to be, whether it's a one-time treatment or a long-term treatment, you're treating patients over time. You're continuing in an environment that is getting rapidly more sophisticated in using data. And when these products are in market in 2019, what we're talking about today is going to have shifted exponentially. We know that's just the way the market's moving.
Dramatically. And so, Michael, let's talk a little bit about Washington, because we are talking about a paradigm shift. I mean, if we look at the modality of treating cardiovascular disease, for the most part, it really hasn't changed. The armamentarium has been pretty consistent for the last 25 years. And as I showed in that slide, the outcomes of these treatments aren't great. But who is going to pay for all of this? There's an outcry in the hepatitis C world with Harvoni and with Sovaldi, and there's a significant Medicare, there's a prison population, and there are still questions about who will pay for that, and that seems like a cure. As we move forward, whether it's CAR T therapy and whether it's some of the orphan indications or gigantic markets like congestive heart failure, how is Washington, preparing for the onslaught that's coming?
Well, they're preparing for it in the way Washington works, which is, by that I mean it's a little bit siloed, right? So you have now, for the last several weeks, there's been a big debate in Congress about the so-called sustainable growth rate for physician payment in Medicare. And, if anybody really wants to know details about that, we'll have a big cup of coffee outside and I can tell you about it. But what's significant about it for purposes of this discussion is that what Congress is about to do, and what, with CMS's blessing, is that doctors in Medicare and eventually hospitals in Medicare are going to be paid based upon a so-called value, alternative payment model. So doctors who are in fee-for-service only are going to start getting penalized in their Medicare reimbursements as an incentive to get doctors and again separately, but hospitals too, into these so-called alternative payment models. Alternative payment models such as, you all have heard about accountable care organizations, but those aren't the only. The reason why that's significant is because all those payment models stress value, they stress cost efficiencies, they stress quality. They're all going to have the quality measurements. So what Medicare is moving towards, and they're doing it, this is why I said it's siloed, they're not doing it to drug companies, they're doing it with doctors, and they're doing it with hospitals, getting them to think about and get paid by how they deliver value and how the systems that they're in deliver value. So it speaks to what my colleagues on the panel are talking about, which is how imperative it is for folks in this industry to be gathering that data and be able to demonstrate things like reduced hospital readmissions. That's always like the big one, right? It's a big coster, it's a big quality of care issue. All of that kind of data that you capture, that you're negotiating, you're going to be negotiating with health plans, it's also going to be critical for Medicare, which is going to be the huge payer, as always, right? So, on the one hand, how is Washington trying to figure this out? Well, they're definitely trying to push the payment system, and really Medicare is the payment system and Medicaid is are the payment systems they have the most control over. They're pushing it to a value-based approach. Now, in terms of the Hep C drugs and all that, for sure, there's a lot of blowback. There's a lot of blowback about this. There was a hearing yesterday about something called the Medicaid, the 340B program, which is a drug discount program. Lots of people were talking about Sovaldi, right? That's the product everybody thinks about. Does that mean that anybody has an answer? Not really, because people kind of grudgingly admit that, well, we're actually curing this previously uncurable disease, right? And we heard at the first panel this need for demonstrating clinical benefit, and if you can do that, you're sort of way ahead of the game. So the sort of sum total of all this for people in this industry is we, as an industry, need to continue to be in there with policymakers and CMS to talk about how our products fit into this value-based system so that we're a part of all these conversations, we're a part of all the policies that are being developed, because that's the only way that we're not going to end up, this industry, is not going to end up somehow being seen as, well, I've got a certain amount of money to take care of these patients, and now I have this really expensive drug. The advantage to us about a value-based system is if doctors and hospitals are getting together to think about what's the best way I can take care of a patient with congestive heart failure, because I have the financial incentives through my Medicare reimbursement of providing high-quality care and being cost-efficient, et cetera, well, that's a good conversation for us to be a part of. And that's, I think, the way we're going to have to manage the system so that we can be ready for all these expensive products.
Okay, I mean it's interesting, and it sounds like over time we're going to see the pricing models develop. One of the things that I worry about is that there isn't a political shift at some point in the future that moves us towards a cost of development pricing model, which we refrain from ever talking about in this country, but certainly is a very predominant model when we talk about like the Japanese market, where they very much evaluate what was the cost to develop, allowing makers to recover that cost plus some monitored arranged profitability. Is there any kind of discussion about that kind of model in Washington? Or we're just not even there yet?
Not really.
Gotcha.
Not really, and certainly not in a kind of a, I don't want to say systematic, but not in a sort of a way where people are really talking about this stuff. And I will say, the other important thing here is that, so when you think about the sort of silo way that Congress is approaching it, so in all these conversations about value-based pricing for doctors and hospitals and systems under Medicare, there's very little overt discussion about, well, what about this Mesoblast product and how that's going to address congestive heart failure, right? I mean, so it's not like there's a lot of sophisticated conversations about that. It's more that Congress deals with the stuff that they know and that they feel like they can control, and that's Medicare payments.
Gotcha.
And that's Medicare payments to providers.
Thank you. And I think that's probably, Brian, why your experience is so relevant, because you were rejected and now you seem to have successfully navigated that. Help me understand, what was the tipping point in getting CMS and Medicare to agree towards reimbursement? What's the efficacy differential of the product, and how is it being received? How's the launch going today?
Sure. So, the real difference to them was just that that additional bit of evidence, and the promise that they would be getting evidence that would be relevant to the patient population that they serve. And one of the things that Michael said, was that as the payment systems are changing under Medicare, what we're going to be seeing, I think, is as the providers themselves are going to be paid for quality, they're going to also be evaluating the products that are out there, the new technologies. And so now it's not just, talking to Medicare or the government or, even to individual payers, although that will continue to do that, but it's also making sure that, your product and your technology are something that the healthcare systems want to use, and that they know that they'll get those quality payments for using your product. So that's another differentiator. And in terms of ours, how the launch is going so far, it's really getting down to the grassroots and talking to the facilities and saying, this is how we differentiate ourselves from the other technologies that are out there. This is the opportunity for you as a facility to demonstrate that you're providing that quality care, so that you'll have the opportunity actually to show Medicare that you're at the forefront of providing this type of quality care, and this is how you do it, by the data collection.
So, Emile, how would you advise Brian if you were thinking about, a patient in wound care where there's kind of an established framework of what someone is willing to pay for diabetic foot ulcers, and he comes along with a new technology. And also help me understand the intersection of Medicare and CMS with managed care and kind of private insurance. How are those two entities linked, if at all?
Well, I'm actually going to start with the second part first. And because Michael was talking about the legislative and regulatory approaches to trying to manage utilization and cost of product, really the biggest government move over the last 7 years has been to just get out of the business altogether and offload that risk to the private sector. And we've seen Medicare go from about 10% private sector run in 2006 to about over 30% today. That actually understates that shift because that's really most of the new beneficiaries coming into the system, going to the privately run system at risk. You see the same shift actually more rapidly occurring in Medicaid, and right now in Medicaid with the ABDs, with the really complex patients that are really the patients that are using the drugs that we're talking about. And so I go back to, you can talk about regulation and dealing with the government, but in the end, these private companies running Medicare and Medicaid are really information technology companies. Their ability to take on that risk is being driven by their ability to push and pull informatics in real time to providers and to patients. And so being able to integrate yourself into that informatics machine with your specific expertise in your disease is key to all of this. And so I would advise really any company to think about that as much as, in a sense, they're thinking about the product itself, because they really have to understand how they're going to be positioned again, going back to 2018, 19, when let's call it 40% plus, because as Medicare is going to ultimately, from our perspective, going to be entirely risk-driven, because it's a much more efficient way for the government to manage that budget item. We know it didn't work for 50 years trying to do it on a fee-for-service basis and trying to do it regulatorily. It becomes a hornet's nest of regulation. You just offload it to a Humana and let them manage that risk. And Humana's going to do it with a lot of technology. And so I guess that's kind of a combined answer to both of those to say that I think you have to look at where the market's headed, which is capitated risk. You have to understand how do I partner, whether it be with the providers that are sourcing that risk from the payers. So it might be with Cleveland Clinic or it may be with Humana directly. My view is that you have to have the payer on board because the providers are diffuse and you're going to end up negotiating with systems around the country. If you can get Humana on board to your value proposition and you can establish with them that you're going to be their partner and really help them bring down the cost of that population by using your drug in the right patients, not in everyone. And those are all part of making you a value proposition, an ROI vehicle for them. Because again, if you're $500 million of cost, but $10 billion of savings, you don't have to market your product. You're going to get adopted by these payers once you can prove your value in the marketplace.
And so one of the areas that we haven't really talked about today is orphan drugs. And one of the things that I think we all see exploding is the number of new orphan indications just seem to be, every day I'm hearing about another orphan indication. A good example for me that comes to mind was Cytori's development of an adipose-derived stem cell therapy for treating some of the inflammation in the digits in the hands and scleroderma patients. In its individuality, I don't think orphan is going to be a problem, but my concern is the aggregate of all of the orphan development today is going to be a huge burden on the system. And, no one really wants to say no. I hear that from the private payers. They don't want to be pilloried by that in the press, but how will that evolve as a separate niche that in its aggregate is rising in terms of its share of burden of the healthcare system? And I put it to any of the panelists who want to opine on the question.
Well, I would just say, going back to your comment earlier about looking at I think this could eventually drive governments and payers to look at cost of development as a medium for pricing of drugs. Because just going out and saying because you have 1,000 patients in the world and now I can price it at $1 million. If that's not associated with the cost of what are ultimately much smaller clinical studies to establish value, I think you're seeing that pressure outside of the U.S. because they're much more coordinated, let's say, in their view of how to pay for product. But I
Michael,
think
it sounds like you're
it's something
agreeing.
that can come to the U.S.
Yeah.
through orphan.
I mean, I think as a corollary to that, there's certainly payers are certainly looking downstream at a pipeline of future potential indications for a product, and they're challenging manufacturers on that. So they'll say, yeah, sure, this might be an orphan drug designation. We get that, and that price might be commensurate with that small population, but we're also watching your pipeline, and we see what the future indications are. One of the first examples of that was Rituxan, that of course launched as a orphan drug indication, follicular non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but there was a steady drumbeat year after year of new indications for that product. And so payers feel like they got burned from the standpoint that, yes, that was an orphan drug, but it became a blockbuster product. And they are now routinely pushing back based on what the downstream budget impact will be when they look holistically at the pipeline of indications.
And I can tell you that that conversation, sort of from a policy perspective, the first time I heard of that was actually about Botox, not a different indication per se, but different use of a product that got approved as an orphan drug. And there was some conversation about, hey, wait a minute, we the government, taxpayers, whatever, gave tax breaks and we gave all kinds of things as we do incentives for developing an orphan drug. And then you, company, went out and not only did you treat this orphan indication, but you've turned this into this, huge product. And so there has been conversation like that, and sort of the hypothetical you're providing is sort of just kind of maybe the next version of that. So I do think that's something that will get people's attention. I will only say, though, that politically speaking, and the sort of rare disease community teamed up with pharma companies that develop these products is pretty formidable. And so we've seen, even as recently as in the Affordable Care Act, where there were, getting rid of the caps for payments and all kinds of stuff and insurance plans. So I do think there will be that kind of conversation about how can you kind of keep stacking if you have an orphan indication. But I think that when you get into sort of government policy, it's going to be hard, I think, for the plans to push back too much.
Well, it just seems like when I look at the aggregate of the cost burden that's going to be placed on the government, that somewhere the system's going to have a shift. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't seem like there's enough pressure, believe it or not, right, in the system yet, but pressure is building around some shift. And so I'm just wondering how a company like Quintiles is going to be advising clients around a potential shift in terms of the reimbursement landscape. And I think we're seeing the beginnings of that with something that doesn't make a lot of sense, which is when we see individual payers negotiating with makers their own discount for their own populations behind closed doors. And so we may have 5 different payers, including the government, paying very different prices for the same therapy.
Yeah, I mean, just touching on something that Michael said before, he used the phrase value-based purchasing, and we know hospitals are doing it. Payers are setting up ACOs based on value-based insurance design, et cetera. So it's just a good leading indicator of what's going to happen next. It's going to be value-based pricing for drugs. And we already see that over in Europe, and there's been attempts of that in the UK. But what we're advising our clients on is that they need to think about demonstrating that value to these different stakeholders, and it is going to be a negotiation in terms of healthcare system by healthcare system. And then just bringing it back to what Emile said, it's really an evidence hub, a data hub that you have to lean on to demonstrate that value, and you link your price to it. So that's really the bottom line, is the fact that patients studied in randomized controlled trials are inherently different than the patients in the real world who are covered by these payers. Yep. And payers now are tired of that risk assumption because they want some partnership in understanding how are these patients different. We know that they don't adhere as well to medication. We know that the providers don't adhere as well to guidelines. We know that they're sicker and they're older than the patients studied in the trial. So you need data to solve that.
So let me give each of the panelists a chance to think about how is cell therapy different in your world versus the traditional drug development? So Michael, why don't you kick us off in terms of, I went back all the way to, I think, 1865, where people were talking about the outrageous drug prices. So how will cell therapy be different in Washington than it's ever been before in terms of the cost of healthcare and new drugs?
I think the advantage that cell therapy has, and perhaps gene therapy, sort of the technologies represented in this room, have two big advantages over previous technologies, previous iterations. One is that they really do have the potential, or in some cases they've demonstrated all that we're talking about, this kind of value, right? The ability to not only demonstrate significant clinical benefit, but do it in a way that's going to be cost effective or cost efficient for the health system. And as we're all talking about, both in terms of that doctors and hospitals are going to be in these sort of risk-sharing kind of approaches, and out of fee-for-service, and private plans are more involved. There's more Medicaid patients in private plans or the private sector. All of that is going to be the environment, which is a different environment than other drugs. So we're came to the fore in. So it's not only that the technologies have the promise of demonstrating that value, they're going to be in an environment where value will be the coin of the realm. And so I think in that very, very significant way, they'll be different. I also think, as I kind of alluded to, the difference in clinical benefit could be just so tremendous that it kind of boggles the mind, right? And that's why we're all here, and that's why we all are working so hard, because we're really, really, and it's not just rhetorically, we're now not just talking about treating symptoms, we're now really talking about changing people's lives and curing disease. And I think that is the other way that they're different, and I think those two things together, and they're obviously related, those two things together is why they're different and why I think the future is good.
Thank you. And Brian, same thing. 1 minute. How is cell therapy different in your world?
Sure. So I think that in our world, cell therapy is different because the payers are actually looking for a differentiating factor, and that's in both the public and the private payer worlds. And while the paradigm has started to shift, I don't think it's quite there yet. They're still asking about pricing. They still want to make sure that if they're going to pay for you, that you're differentiating yourself and differentiating yourself significantly by either curative or shorter, time of treatment, or more efficacious time of treatment. So they're still looking for that, and rightly so. I mean, I don't think that that's going to change, but really I think they're moving beyond just, kind of a transactional relationship, and more of, how are we going to be treating our membership, our patient populations, even as they shift in a consumer-driven environment.
Thank you. Emile, what should we be thinking about?
Well, I was thinking about it in terms of, you mentioned the bogey of hospital readmissions, because it's such a massive cost to really global systems. Once you end up with someone in the hospital, the bills just, as we all know, just become immense. And I think cell therapy is a way to move things into an outpatient setting and to really treat diseases that have been required to be in the hospital on an outpatient basis, whether it's on a one-time basis or on a recurring basis, to be able for these companies to partner with outpatient setting treatment centers and such, and really develop that marketplace, I think is a really interesting opportunity as we look over the next 5 years to really move things out of the hospital where we know people get sicker. There's all kinds of issues with having people ending up in a hospital that we would like to remove from the marketplace.
So data capture after the therapy is delivered is going to be mission critical to demonstrating the total value of the therapy.
Exactly, keeping people out of the hospital.
Okay, great. Thank you. And John, will you close out the panel for us today? Your last thoughts.
Sure. If I had to point to one issue, going back to your question of how it's different, it's really, it hinges on the coordination of care. So what that means is that the onus is on the manufacturer to illuminate those care pathways, determine where their product fits in, and then to optimize that pathway for value. And that requires data to answer those questions, and then follow-up to demonstrate that the pathway is demonstrating the best population outcome benefit at the least cost.
You know, 3 years ago, I would not have dreamed that we would have a panel here talking about reimbursement issues, pricing issues, and how cell therapy will move forward. It goes to show you what a rapid pace this space is moving at. I'm actually very excited because what I see is not only viable therapies that are going to come to the marketplace, but what I see is paradigm-shifting therapies that are, for the first time, going to really be changing the underlying disease course. And what I hear coming from this panel is data, is that understanding the totality of the benefit, whether it's in Washington, whether it's at the individual company, whether it's in negotiating with managed care, or whether it's in the clinical development element, is going to be critical. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you.